So it's now time to start texturing our gas meter. This is always my favourite part of the prop creation process. It's the time when I really think I can bring a prop to life. And it's also the point in which my reference becomes gold dust again. So I'm going to be using Substance Painter for this, version 2019.3.3 to be exact. I'm also just going to inform you all that I will be using source materials from other providers like Textures.com and Megascans. I'll try and call out which ones are from where as I use them, but a lot of the stuff on my shelf has been there a long time and I use it regularly. So I generally just advise you to build up a big library of source materials and smart materials and alphas regardless, and then you can always substitute in similar assets if needed. Plus, it's generally advised that every artist has a big resource library anyway. Megascans is of course free at the time of recording this if you're using it in conjunction with Unreal. Textures.com gives users 15 free credits a day, and obviously there's always the option to create your own source assets as well. So to begin, go to File and then New, and in the New Project dialog window that will appear, bump your document resolution up to 2K. You don't have to do this, say if you're on a lower spec machine, working lower is fine, but I always work at 2K generally. 4K and my Substance client just becomes unusable from a lag after a while. Then find your low poly mesh in your files and bring it in. It's going to look pretty naff until we bring in the texture maps that we baked out from Marmo, so time to do that now. Press the Import button on your shelf panel and then press the Add Resources button at the top of this window. Hunt down the location of where your baked maps are stored and then select them all. Once they are listed here in this window, shift-click to select them all. I'm going to give them the label maps just so that I can search for them easily later, and then I'm going to set their resource type as texture. In this drop-down menu here, make sure to select Import to Project. I don't want them on my shelf forever, so I only want them saved into this particular Substance project. Once imported, we want to get them hooked up with our texture set. I'm just dragging my texture set settings from off screen here. You can see all the map slots are empty, so one by one just drag the imported maps into the correct slots. It's worth noting that the world space normal map slot, that's where the normal object map from Marmoset goes, the naming conventions are very slightly different. Now that they're set up and displaying properly, I can begin blocking in the folder groupings and base colours for everything. I always start by setting up folders first, as it helps me compartmentalize everything that needs doing and work out which bits I'm going to tackle first. I'll start by just blocking in a dull blue-grey for the casing. This is going to be the material that makes up about 80% of the prop. The photo ref shows gas meters of a few different colours, but I think this bluish colour will be nicer than plain black or grey. Then I'll block in the mint green of the dial. I'm actually colour picking this from one of the photos in my PureRef board. It looks a bit vibrant at the moment, but we'll dirty it up later. To mask it off, I'll add a black mask with colour selection, a feature ID map to apply this folder only to the chosen colour. I'll block in the display screen next using the exact same masking method. I'm purely just using standard fill colours for now to give myself an even base. For the padlock, I'm just going to drag on a basic corroded looking metal, in this case the aged brass, which I believe came from GameTextures.com. And although I'm going to most likely deviate from this once I come to doing the look properly, it just serves as a reminder to myself that this element is going to be using metallic values, whereas everything else on the meter is kind of plasticky. Same goes for the copper pipes and bolts. I'm just going to drag on a basic copper smart material that I have in my shelf as a placeholder. And any kind of copper material is fine. Again, this is just a base. This is way too shiny and new looking, so we will be doing a lot more work on these pipes when I come to them. And again, I'm just going to use the color selection feature to mask off these elements. Make sure you are naming all of your folders and layers too. This is important not only for yourself so that you know where everything is, but also if you're in a production environment and another artist needed to edit your file, you want to make sure that it's easy to navigate. So the last two things I'm going to block in the metal dial hands, same as the padlock. I'm just going to drop in a base material that kind of looks like oxidized metal. So I'm just using a steel rough material as a placeholder. And then finally the black plastic flip numbers. Always avoid using pure black in your textures as it's not PBR correct and can look weird in game engines. I tend to go for a dark desaturated bluish colour when I need to use black plastic. Now that everything is blocked in, I'm going to turn my attention to starting to build up the base metal of the casing. You can see from the reference that the metal underneath is very oxidized and rough, and the paintwork on top is peeling away from the edges and corners, presumably from age and wear. When trying to understand a material, I tend to spend a little bit of time Googling for more reference so that I have isolated examples of the kind of colour and microsurface variations typical of it. I suspect that I'm going to have to build a fair bit of this age wear by hand. I usually check Megascans and Substance Source first to see if there's any materials on there that are already close to what I'm after. There's quite a few corroded and rusted metal surfaces that I think could be useful. This one especially, the metal dust on floor. It looks to be really close to the type of metal on the gas meters. So I'm going to download it, and then once it's done, I will drag all the resulting texture maps into my shelf to import them. I'm going to import these to my shelf rather than the project as before, as I'm sure there's going to be instances in the future where I can use this material too. Now, in order to achieve the kind of chipped away peeling paint effect we saw in the photo reference earlier, I'm going to utilize one of these peeling paint smart materials. I have a couple saved. The two I use the most are TFM Edge Peeling by Taylor Brandenberger and the Peeling Paint System by Mario Dalla Bona. Both are free for personal use and available on Gumroad, and you can see that Mario has done an article about his on 80 level. And yeah, I'll be using the latter for this tutorial. So drag the smart material in, and you can see there's two folders corresponding to the paint and the base metal, though it's called Rust by default. I'll rename the Rust folder to Base Metal, as this is where I'm going to work on that pale grey oxidized surface that we looked at in the reference. I'm going to be removing these default layers here and instead creating a new fill layer with the dusty floor texture that I just downloaded from Megascans. Find the maps in your shelf and drag them into the correct slots in the properties window. We don't have a map for metallic, but since oxidized metal is technically no longer a metal, then we're going to leave the slider black. I'm going to turn off the paint layer temporarily so that I can see what I'm doing a little bit easier. Firstly, the scale of the metal needs bumping up so that the splodges become more like small frequency detail. I'm also going to adjust the levels of the albedo because it's currently looking a little dark compared to the metal in the references. I'm also going to add a Hsl filter to drop the saturation and cool the hue off a bit, as it's looking a bit reddish. Now, I don't want this dusty floor material to be quite so ubiquitous, so I'm going to add a black mask and then plug in one of my grunge alphas to add some variation in the intensity that it shows. Normally when I'm picking a bitmap mask like this, I just scroll through everything I have and I kind of wing it. I just go with whatever feels like it's going to achieve the surface variation that I'm after. In this case, I'm going to try Crumpled Rust from Textures.com. I feel like this has a nice variety of values and directionality. Switch to triplanar projection to avoid any seams in the curves, and then add a levels via the effects dropdown so that we can begin to adjust the intensity. I'm also going to just drop the opacity of the albedo a touch so that it's a bit more subtle. I want to add more of a speckled effect to the metal, so I'm going to duplicate this fill layer, but I'm going to swap the fill mask with more of a speckled looking alpha. This dust overlay one, also from Textures.com, looks pretty ideal. As before, I'll then use a levels effect to achieve the desired contrast. From looking at the reference, it's a little tricky to see because of the JPEG artifacts on the photos, but it looks like around the edges of the casing there's a kind of buildup of pale brown dust. To recreate this, I'm first going to grab a rust material, but don't worry, I'm going to edit it a lot. I'll change the colour completely to be more of a beige, remove a lot of the height information, and then bump up the tiling. I started with the rust just because it gives me the high frequency details that I can use to make it look like lots of particles have collected. I'm then going to add a black mask and then start pulling some detail back in by adding a metal edge wear generator. Turn the wear level right down. The key to this kind of detailing is to keep it subtle, and for that reason we want to turn down the grunge amount too, so that it's not spreading everywhere. And just to knock it back even further, I'm going to put a fill layer set to multiplier above this generator and plug in another grunge texture. Because of multiply blending mode, this will subtract whatever is in the fill layer from the result being generated by the edge wear underneath. I'm going to use one of the procedurals native to Substance so that I can control the balance and thus control how much black it adds to the mask. Now is a good time to grab some more stuff from Megascans too. They have a lot of roughness and imperfection scans like these, and I've also noticed some more oxidized metals that I think we can utilize too. The subtle variants in the roughness scans are going to come in really useful for an old and time-worn asset like our gas meter. I'm actually going to use the one that I just downloaded, Parkerized Steel, to start adding a little bit of shine variation in the metal. Again, make a new fill layer. I've actually just duplicated one of my existing ones and then just drag in the required maps. I'm going to bump up the lightness of the albedo again with a levels modifier, and then since I was lazy and duplicated it, I need to replace the information in the mask as well. I know I want this whitish, slightly shinier material to be subtle, so I'm going to pick an alpha that doesn't have a huge amount of white values. The dust overlay from Textures.com should be perfect. As before, we can adjust the levels again, switch our projection to triplanar, and then bump up the tiling. Remember to rename your layers too. I'm going to repeat the same process with the other material that I just downloaded from Megascans. That's the disposable aluminium magazine, as I feel like we could still do with a tiny bit more variation in the hues and the roughness. This layer, which I've dragged near the bottom of the stack, I'm going to tint it a little bit blue to try and remove some of the warmth coming through the albedo. I'm just going to call this blue tones so I remember what this layer is responsible for. At the very top of the group of layers, I'm gonna add a layer to control our hue and saturation. So instead of a fill layer, just create a blank empty layer and set it to pass through. Then add a Hsl filter. This now means we can control the color and values of the whole oxidized metal rather than having to go into each layer and tweak numbers one by one. This is a great way of knocking back saturation if assets are looking a bit too vibrant in engine. Dragging my reference board into the shot, you can see that we still need to bring our values up a lot lighter. Our base metal is looking more akin to the paint in this photo, so I'm gonna add a levels filter to this pass-through layer and use that to lighten everything up too. I'm kind of happy with where this base is at, but there's one or two more things I still want to add. From inspecting the reference again, I can see there's some very subtle areas of yellowish discoloration. It looks either like a dirt or some sort of surface reaction. It's very subtle, but I think paying attention to subtle details like this can make the difference between something looking realistic and not. For this, there's a texture I already have saved from Megascans, which is the Moldy concrete wall. Again, I don't pay much attention to what this texture physically is meant to be. I'm purely just using it for the range of colour information in the albedo. As with the others, create a new fill layer, drag your maps in. For some reason, I apparently downloaded these at 8K, so they do lag a tiny bit when I drag them in. I switched to triplanar projection and then I'll add my black mask. I only want this discoloration to appear very sparingly, so I'm going to use a combination of grunge alphas to subtract information from each other, so that we're left with only a few clusters of this dirty yellow colour. Situations like this, I sometimes also hand paint bits out so that I can tailor the dirt a bit more to my liking. Play around with your settings until you find a level of detail that you're happy with. I'm going to do a quick check of my metallic values via this drop down menu in the top right of the viewport. I just want to make sure it's entirely black and there's no grey values creeping in from any of the layers that we've put in. Lastly, I want to add some scratch shaped variation to the base. I started with a blue tinted chrome material to see how variance and shine would work, but after playing around some, I actually ended up removing most of the channels from the material and changing the colour quite drastically, so you can just use a basic fill layer instead. I'm going to download a couple more scratched paint maps from Megascans, and then I'm going to use one to start bringing in these pale scratches via a fill layer in the mask. I'm going to increase the tiling for this alpha because I don't want huge long scratches. I just want this to contribute to the kind of mottled look. I've decided to chuck on a blur slope with low intensity just to smear and soften some of the noise. So I think now's about the right time to turn the chipped paint back on so that we can begin working on that. First, we're obviously going to want to change the colour away from this vibrant green. I'm going with desaturated blue that I blocked in, but feel free to have your gas meter whatever colour you want. It might be a nice extra challenge and add a bit of individuality if you do pick your own colour palettes. Before I get started on all the wear, I'm going to just take a moment to sort out the height and normal information. All of the height info is coming through from the oxidized metal that we did, so for now I'm just going to turn it off. On the base colour fill layer that we just made, set the blending mode of the normal and height channels to normal, and then set the blending mode of the entire folder to pass through. This will stop the information from the paint blending with the information of the base metal underneath. Much like with the base metal, I'm going to build a lot of this paint by hand by layering up subtle discoloration and grunge. All paint generally fades a bit and it's never evenly, so I'm going to spend a bit of time just observing my references to try and pick out where I can see the subtle change in colours on the surface. I can see there's lighter patches and some darker looking blobs, so I'm going to aim to get these in first. I see this step as kind of like priming a canvas with underpainting. You don't want a perfectly clean base to start off. Some subtle variation will always be a lot more convincing than perfectly CG clean. So to start, I'm going to make a folder just for the primers. I'll clone the base fill layer and turn off the unnecessary channels like height and normal, and then set the colour to something slightly darker and a bit more yellowish. I'll initially start masking it off with a dirt generator just to get some of the darker tones into the crevices, but I will leave some of the dirt spread in so that the flat surfaces receive some colour information too. I'm then going to do my usual trick of using a fill layer with a grunge map set to multiply to knock back some of the values. I'll play around with a few different grunge types until I'm happy. I'm also going to turn the roughness channel back on and make this layer ever so slightly rougher, just so that there's a touch of variation when the light hits it. I'm similarly going to do a similar approach with the paler faded colours. Duplicate the dark fill layer and pick a whitish blue. I'm going to leave the masks in place but invert the dirt mask, since this faded colour won't be appearing in the cavities. Even after playing around with some of the grunge maps and settings, this isn't giving me the look that I want, so I'm going to change the generator to curvature instead. This is going to unmask the convex shapes on edges, the extruding bits of the casing, and you can see that the wire areas are now reserved to the curved bits. This is more what you'd expect, as these areas are going to be what gets scuffed and faded disproportionately. Taking a look at my reference again, I think we can go a little bit darker in some areas, and there's some evidence of more warmer tones in the very subtle grunge. I'll duplicate the darker fill layer again and choose a desaturated orange-brown for the colour. I'm going to remove the masks in place and just apply a fill layer with a leaky looking grunge map. A lot of the grunge we've used up to now has been more blotchy, so I want to get some subtle leaks in order to add some verticality to the variation. Make sure to drop the opacity and adjust the level so that it stays only a subtle effect. You can see I'm going back to the map to drop the balance even more, and then I'm adding a fill layer with multiply to knock back some of the leakiness in places, as I feel it was a little bit heavy-handed. Here I'm just going to go back to the normal map channel and adjust how much information is coming through from the base metal. I had turned it off completely, but I've decided that I do want some influence coming from the metal underneath, but I do want to dampen it down a little bit so that it only subtly shows through. To do this, I just place a blank layer with blank normal information and set the layer blending mode to normal, and then set the opacity to about 60 or 70%. Then set the blending mode to, if it's not already, of the whole folder to pass through. And this blank normal will just help subdue some of the bumpiness coming through. Lastly, for this step, I'm going to start manually painting out bits where the variation is looking a bit too strong, mostly on the sides and on the top where I wouldn't expect there to be quite so much extreme leakiness and patchiness. Now that the kind of primers are done, I'm gonna start tackling all the dust and the dirt buildup, as that's one of the biggest material features of these gas meters and also one of the reasons why I actually picked this prop to study. When picking a base material for dust, I normally start with something like cement or sand, and this is because it's rough, it's grainy, and it's usually neutral colours, so I find that these work well for building up dust. Substance Source has a ton of concrete materials that are really good for this kind of thing. I'm going to be starting with a variant of this one. I'll be using the concrete smooth without the scratches. Drag it onto your layers, set to triplanar, and knock down some of the height range to start. I'm also going to bump up the tiling so that it becomes more of a fine grain. To start masking, I'm going to add a generator as a base. Knock down the dirt amount so it's not quite so all over the place. We want to keep this confined mostly to the crevices where dirt would realistically collect. I'm going to use a grunge map to subtract information again. I've picked something that just leaves kind of big blotches of dirt in. And then I'm going to start painting the mask on top. I do actually hand paint a lot of my dust and my props because I find that masks, like, they're great starting points, but they never quite do the job exactly how I want. I've used a rough texture brush here, and my focus is on pushing back some of the spread of the dust while also increasing the amount that you see in tight corners and cavities. I'm looking at my reference a lot on my second monitor and observing how the dust has built up, and then I'm just attempting to replicate what I see. A quick tip for painting dirt like this: in your brush properties, turn up the size jitter and the angle jitter, and this will add more randomization to your brush strokes and help avoid repetitive shapes. I'm actually not using a tablet for this bit, since I'm just chipping away at stuff that's already there, but I would recommend using a tablet for the finer detailed areas if you're struggling to get the desired result with a mouse. Here I'm just increasing the height position by a very tiny increment so that the dust will appear raised from the surface ever so slightly. With that addition in, I'm just going to continue to dab away at some of the dusty sections. There's really no magic formula to this part of texturing, so apologies if it's a little tedious to watch. All I'm doing is constantly referring to a few of my favourite photo references, but also thinking logically about where build-up would be the most extreme based on real-world knowledge. One quick tip for anyone who doesn't know: I'm hitting X on my keyboard to continuously switch between black and white in my brush properties, and I'm constantly switching as I paint. I've also lowered my brush opacity to 75% as I'm starting to blend. Pen pressure can also assist with this if you're using a tablet. I've noticed this area under the analog gorge is looking super dusty, but actually in the photos it isn't really that dirty. I'm going to make sure just to knock this back a ton. It's the same with the contours around the display area as well. The dust here is a little overboard currently. I want to keep it intense only in the crevices. And exactly the same around this section underneath and inside the dial face as well. It's looking a little cloudy, so I'm going to clean some of that up and refine it. While I'm in the mood for painting, I'm also going to start subduing some of the discoloration on the top of the casing and the rear container. The leaks especially don't make a huge amount of sense, so I've just taken a chunky textured brush with a 75% opacity, and I'm starting to erase some of the darker bits to give some areas of rest. I'm just time-lapsing through this bit as I'm essentially just doing a once-over of the whole model, and I encourage you to do the same. Zoom out and view your model from different angles so that you can immediately spot any noisy or unconvincing areas that you think you can tone down. I'm fairly happy for now anyway, so last thing I'm going to do is just add a Hsl filter to this first layer of dust because I want to darken and desaturate it a bit. So that's the first layer of dust done, but it's not over yet, and to be honest I probably will come back and refine it later anyway. I want to add a second layer that will be less ubiquitous and a fair bit darker. Again, inspecting the reference, in the denser clumps of buildup, it appears that parts of the dust and dirt does get a bit darker, so I'm going to try and recreate that. It also serves us well artistically because I can hopefully break up some of the even looking beige that we have going on. To start with, I'm going to use Mortar Wall for my base. This is one of my favourites to use for dirt and dust because of the colour variation in the albedo. Bump up the tiling for this one quite a bit so there's not a lot of big form shapes. For the colour, I'm going to push it slightly more towards red and then darken it. Moving on to the mask, I'll add a black mask as usual, but then I'm actually going to utilise one of the smart masks in the shelf for a jumping off point. I'm going to use sharp dirt since we don't want this layer of dust to be as spread out and soft as the previous one. Drag it onto your mask and you'll see that the modifiers get added. Slight skip here, as I'd actually noticed from applying this mask that there was some skewing going on in my UVs. I very quickly rebaked and imported the new model and maps into Substance, so we're good to continue. As previously, I'm going to hand paint a lot of the excess dust away and leave it pretty tightly packed in the crevices. You could also try doing this by subtracting different generators, but I digitally paint normally as a hobby, so I'm quite used to the patience required for hand painting, and to be honest, I always prefer the results, at least for personal work. In a production setting, you don't always get the luxury of being that painstakingly meticulous with your texture passes. And then just a quick adjustment to the lightness of the dirt again, because I'm still not quite content with it. So I'm going to get my reference up again because there's also a kind of greeny residue that I can see occurring in some of the dirt, and I think it will be good to get in for a bit of colour variation. I'm going to use the same moldy concrete texture from Megascans that we used on the base metal. This weird residue does seem to occur on surfaces as well as in cavities, so I'm going to begin just by using a grunge alpha in the layer mask. For this one, I'm going to be a bit hacky and plug in what normally is a roughness map for the Megascans texture called Tar Covered Metal Sheet. The original scan is rusty peeling paint, but I like the blotchiness in the values, and I think this will work well for pulling in patches of residue. With this being so light, we're going to have to use levels to bring the values way down and extract the shapes that we want. Once happy, I'm going to add an inverted curvature generator set to multiply to mask off the paler curved outer edges and thus keeping this moldy stuff reserved to the inner surfaces. I'm then adding another fill layer, also set to multiply, with the generic clouds procedural plugged in, just to tone down this layer even more. And then again, some hand painting. This time I'm leaving very distinct but small patches of this residue. I'm not wanting it as softly blended as the previous dust layers. Some last minute tweaks to the dust layers. It's important to pay attention to how well they all work with each other and tone them down or add to them as you see fit. I've just noticed that this indent here for the casing screw, it's full of dust picked up from the dirt generators. I'm going to take a moment just to paint a lot of this out because at the moment it's almost entirely brown and it does not look realistic at all. Some quick additions to the dial plating here. It was looking a little too clean in comparison to the rest of the casing, and then we're good to move on. So next up, I want to add some white scuffs to the outermost edges of the casing. There's some real nice examples of it in the references, and I think scuffs are a great way of adding a sense of movement and storytelling to an asset. So first of all, I've just lazily cloned my blank fill layer and I'm going to change the colour to be a greyish white. Once I've masked it off, I'll begin by adding a fiberglass generator. This generator gives a kind of crosshatch look which we can hopefully build up to looking like scrapes on the edges. Then add a curvature generator set to multiply to mask off everything except around the outermost edges. I'm going to add a sharpen filter just so the lines become a bit more defined, and then I'm going to add a paint layer so that I can start customizing these scuffs, because at the moment they're all very even in magnitude and you wouldn't necessarily getting the same amount of scuffing everywhere in real life. Some of the new Kyle brushes will be perfect for this, in particular this bunch of lines here called Alpha 58. And these should just come native with Substance if you have an up-to-date version. Make sure to turn the jitter settings on your brush down, as we do want more control over the strokes here. My aim here is to reduce the ubiquitousness of this effect. I want it most intense near the bottom, where you might expect the meter has been dragged along the ground, or on protruding bits where it's most likely to have been caught and scraped. I'm using very sporadic strokes on the bottom here. Nearer the top, I'm being a lot more heavy-handed with my removal. I'm going to actually use the polygon fill tool to mask out all the polygons at the top here, as I don't really want any scuffing there. And then I'm going to continue to custom paint these scuffs on the front and the bottom of the casing. You can see in this time lapse that I'm mostly preserving the corners. If I think I've removed too much, I simply switch my brush back to white, and using this alpha, the Alpha 58, I paint some lines back in. Very quickly, I'm just going to add a tiny bit of height information to these scuffs by decreasing the height value in the fill layer, but only by a very small increment. Make sure to pay attention to the canister at the back too. Sometimes I get so focused on doing the front and sides that I can neglect the back a bit, but this is just as important, especially if you're wanting to put the asset on Sketchfab or render out a 360 shot. In a production setting, the back might not be as important, and you might not even have any faces at the back, depending on where the asset will be in scene. Next up, I want to do what I call the Splatter Pass, and this is where I add some of the random black and white smears and little bits that you often see on things. I'll start by adding a basic rubber material and add a black mask. For this, I'm going to use some grunge alphas from textures.com, as they have some great dusty and bitty looking grunges. I would recommend downloading a few for your projects if you have the credits. I'm going to go with the scratched paint one, bump up the scale of the tiling a ton because we only want very tiny details here. We don't want big splodges at all. Use the levels to adjust the contrast significantly, and then because this is obviously way too much at the moment, we're going to use another fill layer to subtract like we've done in the past. We are actually going to do something a little bit different now and add a paint layer on top of others, and then I'm going to use the polygon fill tool to mask the whole thing out. You can now erase that paint layer bit by bit to just pick out the specks coming through from the two mask modifiers underneath. Alternatively, and this is the approach I like to use the most, you can set that paint layer to multiply and then just alternate the grayscale of your brush with the X on your keyboard to dab in information. Because it's set to multiply, the white will never show, meaning you can't add more information into the mask than what is already coming through from the two alpha textures underneath. So I'm now just going to time-lapse through me sporadically adding in some of these black bits. The key here is to not overdo it. This layer should only be really subtle. If you zoom out and you can't see the bits that you've added in, then you know you're on the right track. I want to do the same again, but with white specks this time. You can see from looking at the reference that the meters look like they've been accidentally splattered with white paint, presumably from being a long-standing feature in a house and weathering multiple redecorations. Because of this contextual information, I'm going to try and find a grunge that looks like it incorporates drips. Again, textures.com has a quite nice one, this long splatter. There's a few variations you can download, and again, if you have the credits, then I do recommend doing so. For the base material, I'm going to stay true to life and use this varnished paint, which I believe is another one of Substance's own materials. Darken it a touch. I like to avoid pure white when making old things, and bump the roughness up too. To start making the layer mask, pick a leaky alpha you like the look of, something that has the drips in it, and then drag it into the fill on the mask. Switch to triplanar to avoid those nasty seams and increase the tiling, and then adjust the levels until there's a clear distinction to the drips. To subtract some information, I'm just going to use a fluid procedural. Play around with the balance until you're happy with the amount of white bits showing, or if you think you have an alpha that would work better, feel free to do so. I personally want a little bit more of this white showing through, so I'm going to add another fill layer with this scratched paint alpha, like we did for the black specks, the same textures.com one. Originally I started adding it to the same layer as we'd just been working on, but I realised I wouldn't be able to control the contrast independently of the things beneath it. So I cloned the varnish paint base material so that I could have a version only with this other alpha on, and again use our usual techniques to alter the amount of specks coming through. I think the blue paint is at a good enough point where we can start chipping it away using the feature of Mario's smart material. To begin painting in the chipped areas, navigate to the mask in this group called Base. You should see a whole stack of modifiers with a Paint Me modifier at the bottom. These two at the bottom are where we can start putting in the chipped information. The fill one is called Add a Texture here because that's exactly what you can do. And this is great if you want something to be chipped all over. But for our gas meter, the chipped areas are much more bespoke and influenced by the shape. The Paint Me modifier comes with some information in it by default, so just make sure to erase that first. The photo references show a varying degree of wear, but I think I'm going to exaggerate the amount of exposed metal just for some visual interest. Switch your brush to white and then you can start painting in your chips. Be aware because of all these stacks in the mask and the use of anchor points, and depending on your system specs, there may be a small bit of lag as you paint. I'm going to time-lapse through this section, but as with previous parts in this texturing demonstration, I'm constantly referring to my photo references and trying to paint in chipped areas to match what I see in the real-world counterparts. Corners and extruding areas are going to be key areas here. Also, make sure to use a combination of big shapes and small shapes, and this is just an art fundamental. One thing I've noticed while putting in the exposed metal is how close in values the paint and the metal are to each other, and this is not good for readability of material definition. I'm going to try and lighten the metal by putting a white fill layer, albedo only, at the top of that group, and use some grunges to bring in more dusty white, using the same process as we did at the very start of this video. I'm then going to make another pass-through layer with a levels filter and boost the overall lightness. It's made a small difference in values, but I think I'm going to have to darken the paint on the casing too. So I'm going to make a pass-through level at the top of that respective folder and add a levels and a Hsl filter. I'll use those to push down the value and saturation of the paint until I'm happy with the contrast in the two materials. After that change, I feel like the white specks that we put in show up a little bit too strongly now that the paint is darker. So I'm going to go back to that varnish paint layer and use a chunky brush to remove some of the debris. After that quick diversion, I'm going to go back to the painting in the remainder of the chips that I want. Looking at the ref, there's some minor chips on the top, but I also want to get some into the rear containers paint too, so that I don't end up neglecting it again. So back to that paint me modifier, grab a smaller textured brush and get to work adding in some convincing wear. This front bit here too, there's some nice examples of big bits of exposed metal in the ref, so I'm going to add that in as well. I have also noticed that due to an oversight, the bottom of these pipes is actually the same painted metal as the rest of the casing. So I'm going to remove these from the copper pipe masks using the polygon fill tool for speed, and then I'll use the same tool to add them into the mask of the casing folders. Because I hadn't accounted for these in any of the layers within this casing group, I'm going to have to carve out some time to go back into the dust and dirt layers and remove a lot of this dust. We only really want build-up around the very bottom, whereas currently none of the blue paint is showing through from the sheer amount of dirt. While adding these in, I've noticed as well in the reference there's also a very fine white dust or coating around these pipes. It looks quite different to the dust everywhere else, so I may as well get that in now. I'm going to use a white concrete base material to start with this, though any chalky or rough textured kind of material will do. Make sure it has height information disabled, and then I'm just going to use a combination of a position generator, which uses the world normals to calculate intensity, and hand painting to start introducing this fine dust around the base of the piping and along the top faces. I'm using the polygon fill tool to mask off the rest of the asset, as I only really want this affecting upwards facing surfaces. Next up, I'm going to do something that breaks the rigid PBR theory a little bit and seems to create a lot of debate online, but I always find it helps readability in my assets a lot. And this is to add pure black to the gap where the top and the bottom components of the casing meet. I do this for small things like small vents or grills in assets that would be holes in real life. Create a fill layer that is pure black, 100% rough and 100% metal, as this will absorb all light. I'm going to add a curvature map to start off with, as this should pick up extreme cavity in the gap. Use the polygon tool to remove the bulk of excess information in the mask, and then use your paintbrush tool to carefully remove the rest of the excess black around the target areas. We only want this showing up in the gap here. If you set the paint modifier to multiply, you can start painting curvature information back in without having to worry about going outside the lines, so to speak. I'm then going to use a low opacity brush set to black to just fade off some of the black in this curved bit here, just so it's not quite as extreme. While I'm focused on this area, I'm going to put in the 4 circle indentations. I didn't want to spend the time making these in Geo when I can do them so quickly in Substance. Firstly, make a fill layer with all channels disabled except for height. Set the height to a negative value and then add a black mask. Switch to your brush tool and then find the alpha called Shape Border Circle. This comes with Substance by default. With the alpha applied to the brush, in the Properties window, scale down its border width until the thickness of the line is a lot slimmer and representative of the photo ref. Then just stamp the circles where you want them. I use the UV view for this as I find it easier to eyeball measurements when I'm looking at flat UV islands. You can then adjust the height of the layer if needed. With those little indents done, I feel like the casing is in a good place now. It is the main material in the gas meter, and so it makes sense that we spend the longest portion of time on it compared to the other elements. But now it's time to move on to part 2 of the texturing, where we will tackle the rest of the small meshes making up the meter.